Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the shifting tectonic plates of global economic power. We're looking at exactly what happens when the old world order slams right into brand new economic realities. If you want to understand who actually holds the purse strings in geopolitics today, and more importantly, where that power is shifting tomorrow, well, you're in the right place. Because honestly, whether it's the price of the everyday goods we buy or the stability of the markets we're investing in, these massive shifts affect absolutely every single one of us. So let's just get right into it.
It's honestly staggering to think about the sheer concentration of wealth at the top of the global food chain. Just 7 countries on Earth control an incredible 40% of the global GDP. 40%. But here's the real kicker. Those same countries represent only about 10% of the world's population. That is an immense historical concentration of wealth. And naturally, holding that much of the pie gives this tiny fraction of the globe a completely outsized voice in how our modern world operates.
So who exactly are these 7 nations? Well, the group of 7, or the G7, is made up of the USA, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK. But what's really fascinating is what the G7 is not. It actually has no legal existence. There's no official charter, no permanent secretariat, nothing like that. It's essentially this highly exclusive, super informal club where these leaders meet up annually, rotating the presidency amongst themselves to discuss and try to steer emerging global issues. Now, lacking a rigid legal structure does make them highly agile. They can react fast. But as we're going to see, it also means their massive, headline-grabbing promises aren't actually legally binding.
Section 1. Big promises, big money. When the G7 makes a promise, it usually comes with a pretty massive price tag attached. Get this, they've pledged a staggering $600 billion for something called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, or PGII. This whole thing is designed to mobilize both public and private investment over a 5-year period through a bunch of national and regional initiatives. $600 billion. But you might be wondering, what does a financial flex of that literal magnitude actually look like on the ground?
Well, we can see exactly how they deploy capital during major crises. Take the Global Shield Climate Disaster Fund, for instance. This was announced during COP27 to rapidly provide insurance funding for climate disasters. The name of the game here is speed, deploying capital fast when disaster inevitably strikes. Germany is coordinating this and leading the charge with a €170 million contribution. France has committed $60 million over 3 years, right alongside millions from Ireland, Canada, and Denmark, with the US also expressing its support.
But who is all this money actually going to? Developed in collaboration with the V20, which is a group of 58 highly climate-vulnerable economies, the Global Shield is initially targeting nations that are on the absolute front lines of extreme climate calamities. We're talking about countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Costa Rica, Ghana, Fiji, the Philippines, and Senegal. These are the nations dealing intimately with extreme floods, droughts, and immediate existential threats. So they stand to benefit directly from this kind of rapid response insurance funding. Section 2. A fading economic giant.
Now, there's a pretty stark historical contrast unfolding right in front of us. Back when the G7 was first constituted, they were the undisputed global titans. They accounted for close to 2/3 of the entire global GDP. But today, on a purchasing power parity basis, they hold less than 1/3 of it. Their slice of the global economic pie is shrinking, and it's shrinking fast. And this matters deeply, because at the end of the day, economic power ultimately dictates geopolitical leverage.
Plus, it's not just about a shrinking market share, it's an internal structural issue within these nations themselves. Just look at 2021 gross debt to GDP ratios. Japan is sitting at an astonishing 263%, Italy is at 151%, and the US is at 133%. To make matters more complicated, in 2021, every single G7 country saw their public sector expenditure exceed their actual revenue. Basically, the very foundation of this elite club is carrying some pretty heavy cracks because they are consistently spending way more money than they take in. And this structural weakness, it opens the door wide for a completely new global dynamic. Enter the E7, or the Emerging Seven. This group, which is Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Russia, and Turkey, now collectively accounts for over 1/3 of global GDP in purchasing power parity terms. What does that mean? It means the E7 is officially holding a larger share of the global economy than the G7. It is honestly quite incredible to witness this in real time. The balance of power hasn't just shifted, it has completely flipped.
To really grasp the sheer velocity of this shift, just look at India's trajectory. Today, India is already the 3rd largest economy in the world in PPP terms. But look at these future projections.
They're on track to hit $17 trillion by 2030, and by 2050, a projected $42 trillion. Let that sink in. That would put India in second place globally, just behind China, and remarkably, ahead of the United States. The speed of this kind of growth fundamentally rewrites all the rules of international influence.
Section 3. Cracks in the elite club. As all this global wealth shifts, the structure of the G7 begins to look, well, a bit like a relic from a bygone era. At its core, the G7 functions as this elite club that completely excludes the very emerging economies driving modern growth, like India and China. And because the members are tight military partners, political and defense issues often totally overshadow economic ones. That ends up polarizing the world into opposing blocs. Add in their failure to head off the 2007 to 2008 financial crisis, massive blind spots on contemporary crises like state collapse in West Asia, and past instances where leaders like US President Trump directly challenge their unity, well, all of these points lead critics to argue that the G7 has become a deeply flawed institution.
And you know, these limitations extend right into their grand global promises. For example, the G7 boldly pledged that its members would phase out all fossil fuels and subsidies. Sounds great, right? Yet, they've completely failed to announce any actual actionable plan to do so. It really highlights this growing gap between grand, sweeping statements and practical execution. It's a classic case of writing a check that your policy just can't cash.
Section 4. India's geopolitical tightrope. There's a recent quote that I think perfectly captures the geopolitical pressure cooker of our modern age. It goes, India's tightrope walk between the West and Russia-China has just become more difficult. The G7 statement indicates a point of no return. This really drives the point home. India is walking a razor-thin line between the West on one side and the Russia-China dynamic on the other. And as the G7 takes stronger, much more polarizing stances, maintaining that middle ground, it becomes an incredibly difficult diplomatic balancing act for any neutral power.
We're actually seeing this exact tug-of-war playing out right now in the Indo-Pacific. Remember that massive $600 billion PGII initiative the G7 launched? Well, that was specifically set up to counter China's massive Belt and Road initiative. And India is caught right in the middle of these competing global megaprojects. While India did join the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, they have very carefully chosen not to sign on to the G7's PGII plan just yet. They're hedging their bets, knowing full well that fully committing to one side instantly alienates the other.
Because of this high-stakes environment, India's active role right now is basically playing the ultimate neutralizer in the room. Get this, at a recent BRICS summit, India stepped in to ensure anti-West language was kept out of the final text. Then, during G7 outreach, they did the exact same thing in reverse. They maneuvered behind the scenes to ensure statements condemning Russia and China weren't in the documents they signed. All of this is happening while they actively strengthen economic and strategic ties with other neutral-seeking powers like Indonesia, Brazil, and the ASEAN bloc.
Section 5. Time for a new order.
The harsh reality here is that the world desperately needs a mechanism actually capable of handling today's massive, unsolved modern crises. I mean, we're looking at ongoing trade wars, a very real global economic slowdown, the war in Ukraine and broader geopolitical turmoil, deep instability in Afghanistan and West Asia, and, of course, the existential threat of climate change and non-proliferation. Just take a second to consider the sheer gravity of those challenges. The G7 simply doesn't have the representation or, frankly, the necessary economic leverage alone to mandate effective, universally accepted solutions for these issues anymore.
This is exactly what's driving a massive shift toward broader global representation. While the Group of 7 outright excludes major emerging powers, the Group of 20, or the G20, brings the world's actual largest economies to the very same table. The G20 includes the G7, sure, but importantly, it adds those heavyweights from the E7 we talked about: Brazil, China, India, Mexico, South Africa, and others. It simply reflects the absolute reality of the modern global economy rather than just the history of it.
And because the G20 actually includes the nations driving today's global growth, its power and prestige have firmly surpassed that of the G7. It's a forum for finance ministers and central bank governors from 19 of the world's largest countries, plus the EU. It's just a much more accurate reflection of where global power resides today. And that means the crucial decisions that impact your local economy, your supply chains, and your financial future, they're increasingly happening here at the G20, not the G7.
Which really leaves us with this final critical thought to ponder. Is the G7 actually obsolete in a G20 world? As economic power continues its massive shift from the West toward emerging giants like India and China, these old exclusive clubs might just have to fundamentally change their structure or risk becoming entirely irrelevant to the future of global governance. Definitely keep that in mind as you're scrolling through the global headlines this week. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will see you next time.